Hello and welcome to the Triage Method podcast with me, Gary McGowan, my co-host, Mr. Patrick Farrell, and my other co-host, Mr. Brian O'Hangasa. Paddy, firstly, how are you this week?
I am absolutely splendid. Couldn't be better. Have had a fantastic quasi week off because we're recording this just after Christmas. I don't know when it'll probably be out next week, is it? I can't remember what day we're even on. So I've been nice and relaxed, chilled. Have you been chilled, Gary?
Very chilled. Been enjoying myself. Lovely Christmas at home, spending time with my new puppy. So, happy days. And Brian, how are you, sir?
Yeah, I'm good. I was back in Dublin for about 10 days, catching up with people over Christmas. Had Christmas there. I'm back in Cork now. 'Cause Fiona has a bit of time off this week. So, yeah, it's been very enjoyable Christmas time.
So you went from the best
Wonderful.
county in Ireland to the worst county in Ireland. Interesting.
I'm sure a lot of listeners are in Cork, Paddy. You can't say that.
Surprisingly, we have very few listeners in Cork. And
Maybe that's what.
we have a lot of listeners from Dublin. So I know everyone in Dublin's like, yup.
Yeah. No, yeah, it's been really good. I had a lot of people home for Christmas from various places that I hadn't seen in a while. So no, it was great to catch up. Had a very nice Christmas, and yeah, still kind of quasi time off this week as well.
Love to see it.
Wonderful. And
As Go on, Gary, you can say it.
I was just going to say that Brian is our head of nutrition. Really, that's his special area is nutrition coaching. And last week we spoke a little bit about goal setting more generally and how we can move into the new year optimally. And I think that while training is of course an area of interest, nutrition is probably the area where you'll see most information over the next few weeks because a lot of people at this time of the year are focused on weight loss, especially coming out of the Christmas period. People will find themselves, going on diets that probably won't work in the sense that they're not going to stick to them. People might be in a bad place in terms of their relationship with food coming out of Christmas. So there's a lot of nutrition related issues that we end up solving as trainers during this period of time. So we wanted Brian to come on and discuss that today. But also what we discussed last week was a little bit of a reflection in terms of how our own years went, me and Paddy. And obviously, you're probably sick to death of listening to me and Paddy each week. So we wanted to ask Brian now, give him the chance to tell us a bit about how his year was in terms of at the outset, what were you aiming at with your training? Obviously, you like me and Paddy, you do jiu-jitsu, you're also in the gym, maybe you have other goals. I know Paddy does a little bit of your programming or all of your programming. So tell us a bit how the year has gone overall from a training perspective, maybe from a nutrition perspective as well, any obstacles, etc.
Yeah. I mean, just to say, Paddy fully coaches me. It's not just kind of, it's not
Yeah.
half-assed whatsoever. So he fully
I
programmed.
rule his life. I'm like, don't eat that. Slap it out of his hand.
Yeah. No, there's a lot of input that says, look, I trust that you know what to do with your nutrition. So, carry on with that. But yeah, the training programming for sure. Paddy has the reins of. So let me see. So during the year, yeah, so actually one of the top priorities at the start of the year would have been to obtain the blue belt in jiu-jitsu because I had a grading in would have been about November 2021, and I was told what things I needed to work on in order to get the blue belt because I was assessed for it and didn't get it. So that was a pretty clear target to aim at, and did get that then in May. There was a grading in May. I competed again in May as well, just before that grading. Got a silver medal in the IBJJF Dublin Open. So that was good. Should have got gold. Paddy gave me a really hard time over that, but look, it is what it is. No, not really. And I was playing basketball at the time as well, actually, yeah. So I haven't played basketball since. That season, actually, the last game of the season was the same week as that competition. So very poor timing in terms of peaking, like trying to peak for both. but got it done. I was dealing with a good bit of knee pain, like from basketball, and that was one of the main things Paddy was helping me with throughout the time he's been coaching me. So it was getting better, but it was hard to get ahead of it when I was, especially if I was playing like one game a week. It was okay. Playing 2 games a week, along with jiu-jitsu and everything else, was a challenge. So took the summer off, worked on the rehab with that. Made a lot of progress with it, but I decided it wasn't going to be worth playing again this season. So just taking the full year off to keep rehabbing it, and like, you know, now my knees feel really good, and you know, the prospects for playing again next season is probably there, but we'll see if I want to or not. It was fun because I'd come out of retirement after like 10 years of not playing on a team. It was good crack, like, and enjoyed it. And then like always kind of looking at getting bigger and stronger like throughout the year. I did get COVID in July, and then that, I think I had long COVID after that because my recovery just went really poor. Like, training is normal and just not recovering, and then digging a recovery hole eventually, and like fatigue just was accumulating over time. So eventually kind of decided it probably was that, because it's not the kind of thing you want to place blame on, because there was a lot going on. It's like, I don't want to just say, oh, it's probably long COVID, but upon reflection, it actually probably was. So then Paddy adjusted the programming to facilitate more recovery, leaving more reps in the tank. And as a result, now like probably like 4 to 5 weeks of feeling quite good again. After a couple of months of kind of having to peel back the training intensity. But the last 4 or 5 weeks have been great, like kind of building things back up again, resolving some niggles that had cropped up in that time frame. And yeah, training's been really good the last kind of month or so. Now I need to do more jiu-jitsu, because now that I have the blue belt, you know, purple belt is next. So, you know, we have to be working on that. And yeah, just continuing to get bigger and stronger and make sure recovery is good. That's kind of a meld of where we've been and then where we're going now. You want to say anything on that, Paddy?
Yeah, you're a bit of an interesting case study, because at the start of the year, well, like I've been coaching you for what, two years now or something like that. But at the start of this year, like we had, well, and at the end of last year, you were basically a dual sport athlete. So you were doing basketball and jiu-jitsu, right? And you weren't fit enough, let's be honest. And also you were dealing with knee pain, right? So, well, there was actually adductor pain and a little bit of low back kind of referral pain. But anyway, you were dealing with pain. So you're like the perfect case study of, I'm an athlete, I'm, you know, training away hard, but I have all of these other fucking issues going on that need to be addressed, you know? And I think we did quite well with all the stuff, you know, and a lot of that comes down to like auto regulation, managing intensity, focusing on the highest yield, high return things, and going, okay, look, we can't look after this adaptation or this attribute. Like, we're not going to progress it right now, but we can at least try to maintain it, you know? But yeah, at the start of the year, obviously your recovery wasn't great when we had 2 basketball games. So that was obviously a big thing. But since then, even over the summer, even though obviously we're thinking you had long COVID, over the summer, I feel like we still managed to do a huge amount in terms of, you were getting stronger, you were getting fitter. Like, obviously there was ups and downs across that. And the only reason I bring that up is because a lot of people in your situation, if you're like a dual sport athlete, they'll just be like, oh, look, I don't have time to allocate to resistance training or, you know, cardio training outside of that. And look, that's a very real thing. Like, if you have a job, which you do have a job, you know, like there's other stuff going on in your life. However, you can get a huge return on a very small investment. Like, I think at stages we were just doing 2 resistance training sessions per week, you know, and it's like, you can get a huge return off of that and still do your sport, you know. And also, just because you're dealing with something like long COVID in this case, it doesn't mean that you have to completely give up everything, you know. Now obviously it's going to be different for everyone, like any illness, whatever, it's going to be different. So it's not like you're the perfect case study of like, oh, if I can do it, everyone can do it. That's never usually the case. But we can use this as a bit of an example, going like, okay, well, you can do something. You might not be able to be at your peak, you might not be able to do all the things that you wanted to be able to do, but we can still be ticking away at some of your goals, you know. Like I would say on the whole, looking at this year, it was a very productive year, you know. Like you got a lot done, you're a lot stronger, fitter, generally a more robust individual, which was the goal. Now obviously we have specific goals and whatever else, but I think you did quite well.
Yeah, it's a good assessment.
Anyway, we're not here actually to talk about you, Brian. Review. We just did that because we're nice people. We just wanted to hear about your life, you know. We're here to talk about nutrition, and specifically, we want to hopefully help people set their nutrition up for the new year. Now, a lot of the advice that you get in this space is very generic. And we're going to start with some generic advice, right? Because that's actually where you need to start, because we can go into, oh, this deep dive specific, this is exactly what I do with my clients, and this is how I coach this individual, blah, blah, blah. But it's actually somewhat irrelevant unless we have the foundations in place, right? And again, you're going to be getting exposed to terrible information, usually online. New Year's, everyone thinks, oh, I can do this myself. And they go on these crazy diets that they just concocted in their head. And they're like, that'll work. So hopefully we're going to help people set things up correctly. So at least you have the foundations. And then hopefully by the end of this, we'll have gone into some of the more, you know, coaching specific things that we do in terms of how do we translate these like generic, you know, advice. Because that's the thing, like you can literally fucking find this stuff online. It's not like it's groundbreaking stuff, you know, but it's the actual implementation of this stuff that makes the difference. And that's where the coaching side of things comes in. So anyway, Brian, how do we set up a diet, right? Run me through this. I just go, Brian, got my friend, they want to get coaching with you. They've never done anything like this before. Maybe they're going for some fat loss. That's the kind of goal, because I know a lot of people, that's usually the goal in New Year's. What do I do? They want to just, they're happy to take their time with it. They're not going, oh, I need to lose 20 kilos in 4 weeks. They're like, I just want to set things up straight properly, and I want to get the results this year. I want to be in a better place by the end of this year than the start of this year, you know? So where do we start with them?
Yeah, so, you know, people need to keep in mind that nutrition related goals are a result of what you do over the medium to long term and what you do regularly and consistently. So we have to think about, okay, what things do I actually need to do consistently to achieve this sort of an outcome? And then once we've identified those things, we want to help people put those into place, right? And how will you know what those things are going to be? Well, you need to get a baseline of where someone's, you know, nutrition and lifestyle actually is at. So for that, we can definitely just come in and say, okay, look, I want to see what, you know, 1 to 2 weeks of your normal eating habits looks like. And like this time of year, that might be a little bit hard to pin down because, you know, people don't want to define themselves by, you know, the 2 weeks over Christmas and how their diet was then, right? They don't want to say like, that's what I do most of the time. If they're getting on the path towards a health kick, you know, what they've done, you know, maybe the last couple of days, or maybe, you know, this is the week of New Year's. So maybe next week when they start getting stuck into this, they have very different ideas of what their diet is going to look like. So you need to, you know, basically get what's a normal week look like, you know, probably not what the Christmas period looked like, because that's not really representative, but also not what, you know, your quote unquote ideal diet looks like, which you might, you know, whatever you think that is, you might sustain that for a couple of days or whatever, or a week, before you probably start to gravitate towards your original habits, because those are the ones that are actually formed. And like you see this all the time with you know, questionnaires that people do when they sign up for coaching. It's like we ask them, you know, what does a typical day or week of eating look like? And in a lot of cases, based on what people fill in there, it's like, cool, well, you don't need my help, so we're not going to go ahead with coaching because they fill in like the ideal diet, and where it's like, that's not. I see why people want to do that. Like, they obviously want to have the best representation of themselves, but it doesn't actually help us establish a baseline. So we need to establish a baseline before we can start making adjustments. Yeah. And that can be through tracking. It can be just through keeping a food diary without tracking. I think there's a lot to be gained from tracking for at least a short period of time. A couple of weeks or whatever. Because like, I would dispute the idea that it's hard to track. Sometimes people make it out to be this really tedious thing, whereas like realistically, if I have to ask you to keep a food diary, it's just as tedious, if not more so. Because you still have to write in the things that you ate, and then you probably have to transfer it somewhere into your check-in, and then if it was on MyFitnessPal, I can just sync up with that and just look at it there. So I don't think tracking is incredibly difficult. Now, people definitely struggle with it in certain situations, like if it's a meal that they haven't made themselves or they're eating out or something like that. But that's just, coaching is essentially problem solving and helping people overcome hurdles and giving people the knowledge and ability to manage that stuff for themselves. So that's just a very common obstacle that comes up that we have to navigate. It's like, oh, well, I don't like tracking because when I eat out, once or twice a week, I don't know what to do there. So that's, we have solutions for that.
Just on that, because I know so many people struggle with this and they're like, oh, well, I don't want to track, or I tracked before and I didn't like it or whatever. Like, you have to just view it as a tool. It's simply a tool in your toolbox. It's one of the most effective tools. We can do other methods. You can literally, like you said, write the foods down, the portion size that you think it was, take pictures. There's a variety of other methods. However, tracking is one of the most beneficial methods because it actually teaches you so much. However, that also means that there is a bit of a learning curve to it, and there's going to be issues that you run into. Like you noted there, a very common one is, oh, well, I don't know how to track when I'm eating out. But that's a skill that you learn by doing it. You don't learn that skill by not doing it. Like, you're never going to learn the skill of tracking or staying on track while you eat out if you don't actually practice it. You don't actually like acquire that skill. But yeah, what I always say to my clients is, look, we're going to use calorie and macro tracking at the start. For the vast majority of them, that's what I do. We're going to use it at the start. We're going to help you get your diet on track. We're going to help us like analyze your diet, see where it's at, see what needs to be changed. And then we're going to get it to a stage where this stuff is on autopilot. We've just used MyFitnessPal, for example. There are other tracking apps. We just use MyFitnessPal to teach you about the diet, get things set up. And then once we have a good structure, we can start moving away from it, which maybe we'll talk about later on.
And awareness creates change as well. Like, so if you've had maybe some conversation about a new client with a new client about what their diet is going to look like in terms of what we're aiming at, like something like, fruit and vegetable intake, and then they track for a couple of weeks and they see, well, I eat, one portion a day, and it's like, okay, well, I'm very conscious now that doesn't cut it, and I can see very clearly what needs to be changed. So it creates awareness, which is really, really important for making any sort of behavior change.
As well, sorry to interrupt again. Like, that's actually something that you see almost ignored oftentimes in the health and fitness world, right? And the fruit and veg one is actually a good example, because you'll see people go, oh, well, I don't track my vegetable intake, or I don't track my greens or whatever, which is perfectly fine, right? But then you actually get these health and fitness people to actually track their food, and all of a sudden you're actually only eating like 10 grams of fiber per day, because you're eating like lettuce and spinach and stuff like that, which, yeah, it does have fiber, but it's actually not a huge amount, So because they've ignored it, because they're like, oh, well, I don't need to track fruit and veg, or I don't need to track, that kind of stuff. It's fine. It's just in a good place. I eat loads of it. It's the exact same thing as people saying that, oh, well, I don't need to track my food because my food's on point. I eat loads. If they're trying to gain weight, I eat loads. And then you actually track it and you're like, you're eating 2,000 calories, like, awareness does allow you to see where you're actually at, and then you can change because of that. But also, bringing awareness to something naturally makes it change in and of itself without a conscious choice. Like you said, like if you start tracking, usually people just start, oh, I don't want to eat that food that I normally would eat because I don't want to have to track that. I don't want to have to add that to my total, you know?
Yeah. And I will add there as well, like even people who have had experience tracking doesn't mean they're good at it, you know, which is because like it is a skill to be developed. And look, like we've all looked through thousands of days worth of food diaries like over the years across our clients, right? So we're very good at spotting errors. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, and you see some wild entries every now and again, you know, because in MyFitnessPal the database is user managed, so it is prone to error. So you see it all the time, like you know, either the calories for something might be okay, but then the macros are like way off, you
Or they're
know.
not even in it. They're just someone who's like, oh, just put in the calories and all the macros are blank.
Yeah, I think MyFitnessPal have a. I think you have to add that stuff in now if you're adding a new food. But obviously a lot of that stuff is there like for many years at this point. Or you know, there's something is listed as having crazy amounts of fiber, or more commonly just no fiber at all. So people get shortchanged on their actual fiber intakes. And like this is what I say to people: like you have to kind of like fair enough if you're a sort of a beginner with this stuff, you may not have that awareness, but like you need to look at the entries and say like, does that look right? You know, you need to have some sort of cognizance around that because that'll help you avoid mistakes. And look, you know, I point these out to people when we see them, especially in the first few weeks. It's like, look, okay, this is an error here, or you're not getting the fiber contributions from that food. So let's find something else. And like as well, you know, people, you know, for say someone goes out for like a coffee and a scone or something, and they just put scone in, and it's like, all right, there's scones for 150 calories, and there's scones for 600 calories. So, you know, people obviously have a tendency to lean towards the lower end, right, which may not be correct. You know, so like you can usually find that information, you know, by using say generic not generic, sorry, but like kind of chain establishments like Starbucks or something, right? They'll have their nutrition information on there somewhere. I think they sell scones, right? So be able to figure that stuff out, but also not gravitating towards the lowest of all those things. So all these things you need to help people with. You know, there's a lot of errors that go on, but again, that's part of the education process of actually understanding your food better, understanding nutrition better, being able to actually track properly. Because like a lot of people might say like, oh yeah, I tried tracking and like it didn't work for me. It's like, well, it actually is something that you may need a bit of guidance on to actually get good at it. And you have to kind of be engaged with it as well. Like I said, actually look and say, oh, does that look right to me? You know, the calories are your 500, but if I add up all the macros, it's like 1500. It's like, so obviously something wrong there. So that's important.
Yeah, just I hate to say it, like there's a right and a wrong way to use MyFitnessPal, but there is a better and a worse way. And this is also not just what you're saying in terms of being like cognizant of the actual, oh, is this the correct choice to make in terms of the, like you said, the scones. It's like, oh, I'll choose the 150 calories one versus the 600 one. Like, yeah, you need to do that, but you also actually need to learn from what you're doing. Like you need to like, for example, you'll see people go, oh yeah, I track calories and macros, and they basically wing it every single day. Their days have no structure. There's no like typical meals. There's no, you know, meal distribution like thought about. It's all just like, I'll track it as it comes. And that can work fine. You know, that can work fine, especially if you're on higher calories. You're just like, I just need to eat my calories, hit my protein, and we're good to go. But it doesn't actually teach you good eating habits, you know, if you're using MyFitnessPal like that. What we generally try to get people to do is actually use MyFitnessPal to help you structure your meals better and actually have a general day structure. And I know, Gary, you're pretty big on this with a lot of your clients as well, where you want them to actually, here's what a normal day looks like in terms of what do your, say you're having 3 meals a day. It's like, what do your breakfasts look like? Could you eat roughly that breakfast without using MyFitnessPal? Like, do you have a general meal structure, you know? Stuff like that, because it actually makes transitioning away from MyFitnessPal so much easier. Like if you are someone that just tracks your calories, you know, wings it on the daily, eating completely different foods every single day, eating completely at random times, whatever, Like, yeah, that it feels like you have a lot more freedom, but it's actually those people that say that MyFitnessPal is the hardest. They're the ones, oh, it's so tedious. It's like, yeah, because you're just tracking things randomly. You're not doing any kind of pre-planning, any kind of like general organizing of your day so that you're making it easier for yourself. Like, we eventually want to put this stuff on autopilot. So how do we do that? We create some good meal structures. We can create some good like general day of eating, and you basically don't need to rely on MyFitnessPal then. But we're just using MyFitnessPal to help you create those days, you know? So as I said, like, I don't want to say there's a right and a wrong way to use MyFitnessPal, because look, you can use the tool a million different ways. But there definitely are better and worse ways, in my opinion, to use a tool. And I think a lot of people, unfortunately, don't learn to use MyFitnessPal correctly, and they're the ones that actually struggle.
Yeah. And as well, like throughout this process, you want, because you mentioned, you know, eventually moving away from having to track, you know, you need to be kind of engaged with the tracking, and again, being kind of switched on and observant about what's going on. So I said, you know, you're looking at things, does that look right? But then also kind of taking stock of, okay, what do my typical meals actually look like in terms of their calorie and macronutrient composition? Because you could have people who track for, you know, 6 months, and then, you know, take away tracking for a minute and say like, oh, well, how many, what are the macros and calories of, you know, your breakfast? And they'll be like, you know, they won't be able to tell you, or they won't be able to tell you the nutrient composition of, you know, the 10 foods that they eat on a very regular basis, which is a bit of a waste, in my opinion, like that.
Yeah, if you do, or you find yourself in that situation, like, that's actually not a huge issue if you're still able to go, oh, this is generally what I need to eat. This is what a rough breakfast looks like in terms of the volume of food, what my plate looks like, etc. You know, like, you would still be able, like, I always use the kind of thought experiment of, look, if, I don't know, an EMP went off over the servers of MyFitnessPal and it's just gone, you know, it's broken, they have to start from scratch again. So would you be able to eat, you know? And a lot of people who just wing it, they would be like, oh no, like, I don't know what to do with my diet anymore. I don't know how to organize things, you know? A lot of people who don't, like you're saying there, like, don't know what the, you know, the contribution of their food is, in terms of, it's like, oh well, like, you know, 100 grams of chicken has roughly 25 grams of protein. Like, if you don't know very rough estimates, you're going to struggle. And the only way to get away over that, if you don't want to be really paying attention to the different meal choices, or the food choices, you need to have more of a structure, and you need to be able to go, okay, so a breakfast needs to look roughly like that. That's probably around 600 calories based on what I've previously done. Cool. You know?
Yeah, you like, you start to learn. It's like, okay, a portion of protein rich food will provide this much protein. So if I have that on my plate, that's ticked off. And then the same with things like carbohydrates, things like fruits and vegetables. And this is something that I talk to clients a lot about. I'm going to put together some sort of content or guide on this. It's on my list of things to do. But like, there's actually not a huge amount of variation food to food. Like, yes, there's thousands of actual foods, and I talk about this a lot. I'll use an example of, like, you know, let's say like treat foods, or, you know, sweet treats, right? So you go into the shop, right, there's fucking hundreds of options in that category, but the actual nutrient composition and the macronutrient calorie composition is not going to be that different, right? Because they all have kind of the same combination, like slightly varying quantities, but roughly speaking, pretty much the same combination of like carbohydrates and fat. Okay, there's some special categories there where they have slightly less, you know, say ice cream, right, higher water content, right? So it doesn't actually meet the same as like dry goods. But what I say is, like, for kind of dry goods, it's in around 500 calories per 100 grams, right? Cookies, pastries, donuts, cakes, tarts, all that stuff, chocolate, right? All that stuff is in around that value, right? So like, you don't have to know the value for all those foods, right? Because then if you eat one, you're like, oh shit, I haven't eaten this in like months, and I don't know what the nutrient composition is. It's just the same as all those other things, more or less. You know, it's like, there's obviously a bit of a range for this, and, you know, I'm just kind of landing in the middle, but like, roughly speaking, it's not going to be that different, right? Especially kind of examples, like I said, ice cream or things like jellies, right? Because they don't have any fat in them, right? So they're a little bit lower in calories because they're just basically sugar, right? So they're a little bit different. But all that other stuff, pretty much the same, right? And then that kind of thinking extends to the other food groups as well, the other macronutrient groups, foods that you have to learn to identify as like, okay, these are high carbohydrate foods, right? They're going to have roughly the same macro composition, right? And roughly the same calorie composition, right? So there's a little bit of variety. And then we also talk about that, right? And you can talk about the fiber content being a little bit different for certain ones, but it's actually not going to vary that much. This also applies to protein rich foods. I just break them down into either lean or fatty protein sources, right? And potentially there's 3 in that category, where there's like lean, fatty, and then very fatty, right? Which there's not that much in, but like things like maybe lamb and sausage and stuff will be very high fat, and the fat may be higher than the protein content or equivocal. And then you've got the kind of fatty proteins, like things like oily fish and chicken with say skin on, and certain cuts of beef and things like they do have obviously some fat in them, but they're more so protein. And then you have the really lean ones, like so lean beef and chicken, like boneless, skinless chicken, white fish, etc. Like all those things lumped together in the same category in terms of the actual nutrient composition. So you don't actually have to remember, like, if you're eating turkey, you're like, fuck, I don't have turkey a lot. It's like, it's only at Christmas. But if you have, what looks like a chicken breast amount of turkey on your plate, it's the same, right? It's the exact same. So that's something people, I don't think are very conscious of. I think it just makes the whole nutrition thing a lot simpler, because you don't have to have this huge database in your head of like composition of foods. You'd be able to identify, okay, what category is that food in? Okay, cool, it's carbohydrate food. Okay, within that, is it like on the higher end of the carbohydrate density, like something like cereal or rice, or is it on the lower end, like something like potatoes, because again, the water content is a little bit higher, right? And then, or maybe like fruit or something. So that's some of the ways I think about nutrition and try and teach people about nutrition, because I think people can get overwhelmed and be like, oh my God, there's so many foods that I have to know about, but there really isn't. Like, yes, there's thousands of foods, but they all lump together in a few different categories. You don't actually have to know that many. You might have to have like one reference food in your head for each one, and then you can go from there. So it's a bit of a tangent, but I think that's important for people to understand, that it's not as complicated as you might think. But let's actually get back on track and go back to this person.
Jump in as I usually do. There's also a huge like internal focus that we can be learning about, like, oh, how full do I feel when I eat, this rough meal, and how hungry do I feel in between meals, like, and that'll give you a bit of a guide in terms of if you have the right calorie distribution, and also macros to an extent. Obviously, they're a little bit less informative in the shorter term, like, how do you know if you've eaten enough protein? Like, it's not like it's something you can feel, although you do feel a little bit fuller from that. But anyway, we won't go into the internal focus stuff as well. Let's get back, like you said. So look, how do we set this person's calories up, Brian? Because I know that's what everyone wants to know. They're like, oh, where do I set my calories? As you said earlier on, ideally you want someone to be tracking for a week or two to get an idea of where they're currently at. Now, they're probably going to change their intake based on the fact that they're tracking. They're not going to eat the same food, but let's assume that they do. They're like, yeah, okay, this is just a general representation of what I eat on a general day. Where do we go from there?
Yeah, so if you have established that baseline of a couple of weeks, it's a couple of weeks, right? So we need to look at, if someone has fat loss goals, right? We obviously need to put them in a calorie deficit. And how do we establish that? Well, we know you're going to be in a calorie deficit when you're losing weight consistently over time, based on how you're eating and based on other lifestyle factors like your activity levels. So, and like, you need to do this over the course of at least a couple of weeks, because, well, for many reasons, but for example, it helps us iron out some of those errors that you might be having in your tracking. It's like, you might track poorly, choosing all the lowest calorie values of all the foods that you eat, and it comes to 1,200 calories or something, and it's like, oh, and that's one of the ways like people come to, oh, I only need 1,200 calories and I still don't lose weight. It's like, okay, well, let me help you correct some of that stuff, right? This doesn't really look right here, based on what you're eating. So it gives us time to adjust for that, but then also gives us time to actually like for the changes to accumulate over that time frame, because this is another issue people have with like taking charge of their nutrition and body composition, is that they expect too much too soon, and then when they don't see that, they can give up, or they start doing other mad shit. They're like, okay, this basic approach that the lads in Triage are talking about isn't working, so I'm gonna go try carnivore and see if that works for me, right? Because I did a week of calorie counting, and I was supposed to be in a deficit and nothing happened. But you need to give that stuff like a couple of weeks to actually kick in, so to speak. And based on 2 weeks of data gathering, we can decide, okay, this person was eating 2,500 calories a day on average, right? So you have to take the average of the week rather than just what day to day looks like, or just like the total calories consumed in the week. If you want to look at it that way, you can. Where did that leave them in terms of weight fluctuations, right? And as well, that's another reason to extend this stuff over a couple of weeks, because weight will fluctuate. I was joking with Paddy today that he was like, I want to get you up to like 95 kilos over the next few months, and I was like, bro, no problem. Put on like 4 kilos over Christmas weekend, so I'm like 80% of the way there, right? Like 5 months ahead of schedule. I got it. Right? But that is going to come off, right? That's a temporary fluctuation, just based on the eating over the Christmas weekend, right? That stuff will track back down. That is what I've seen over the last few days. But most people don't know to expect that, right? So you need to give it a couple of weeks, let that stuff kind of iron itself out, thanks to the temporality of it. And then see, okay, did I lose weight? Did I gain weight? Did my weight stay the same? Like within certain degrees, like if weight is down by like 0.1 kilos, like I would just qualify that as staying the same. 2 weeks, 1.1 kilos of a change is not much. So we'll say, okay, cool. Based on that, where you were currently eating is maintenance. So now we need to actually put you in a deficit. So we might subtract 10 to 20% off those calories that you tracked, and that based and keeping all the other lifestyle factors in like when we're manipulating variables, you want to manipulate as few as possible, and we don't want things like your step counts and your training volume to like vastly different week to week, because then you're controlling the energy inside of things, but then the energy out is all over the place, and you don't really know where you're at. So you want to standardize as much as possible, and then just manipulate one variable at a time. In this case, your calorie intake. So it'll put you in what should be a deficit then, and then you can take it from there. So I think that's the best way. You could, in theory, like estimate your total daily energy expenditure using an online calculator. Like if you just Google TDEE, because that'd be hard to hear actually. And then to just like plug in your numbers there, then that should they'll give you a decent starting point, but you still have to then go and test that for a couple of weeks. And there are issues with that doing that approach, because for example, myself, if I went and did one of those on Alex, okay, it's Stevens' day now, I'm gonna get back on track. I'm gonna go figure out where my calorie requirements are. If I plug in my 4 kilos heavier than my actual weight after that weekend, it's gonna give me a much higher estimated energy requirement, which is going to be misleading then. So you have to take that into account, because a lot of people are probably sitting around their heaviest, now and then this time next week. So you need to just be aware of that, because again, most people aren't going to be aware of that. They're just going to see that number having gone up by a lot, and they're like, oh fuck, I need to do something about this now, and then get stuck again. So that might throw things off there from that perspective. And I think the I think the main cause for error in that method is the estimation of your activity levels. I think people are pretty poor with that in terms of like which activity multiplier to use. I think people tend to overestimate that. So if I am setting up someone's calories using that method and they tell me their activity levels, I'll probably set it 1 degree lower on the activity multiplier, to be honest, and that usually puts it in the sweet spot. But either way, you're gonna have to start somewhere and then make adjustments based on what actually happens. Okay, so that is a common rule for all this stuff. Does all that make sense?
Absolutely. And just one note on the calculator side of things, there can be a lot of variance in the ones that you look at online. And one of the better ones, which is more like evidence-based and reviewed over time, would be from the NIH. So it's at niddk.nih.gov/BWP. I'll put that in the description box. I just remember the URL because I often send this to people. But it's on the NIH website from the US, and it's their body weight planner. And what it will give you is not just that kind of basic information of like how to set your calories, but if you can set different rates of fat loss, it'll give you an idea as to how your body weight will change with the metabolic adaptations of dieting over time, as opposed to just predicting it in a fixed manner, which is obviously not ideal. Because that's something we always say to clients is that, you know, if you've set your calories in accordance with what Brian has done there, that will work for a number of weeks. But now you're at a new body weight. And if you're 5 kilos lighter, now your TDEE or your maintenance calories is going to be lower. So now we need to adjust our rates according to that. So that's one of the only planners that actually does that, to my knowledge, because it's created by Kevin Hall, who's a fairly prolific kind of fat loss obesity researcher. So check that out. Other than that, I don't think I have anything else to add, but I'll put that in the description box.
Yeah, it's a very good point. That sounds pretty cool. Actually, wasn't aware of it, but Kevin Hall, yeah, is a G. And it should be pretty easy to conceptualize. I think I heard Paddy talk about this on a podcast first, maybe even before I started working with Triage, which is pretty standard because, you know, I've learned a lot from you guys over the years.
An idiot. That's your problem, not mine.
What?
I said I'm an idiot, so it's your problem if you're learning from me.
You said, you know, imagine wearing a weight vest. You know, you today puts on a 5 kilo weight vest and just wears that all the time versus you not wearing the weight vest. You know, who expends more energy? People are very, very easily able to think, well, yeah, obviously the person who's heavier because I'm having to carry that weight around. And it's the exact same situation. Like if you've lost 5 kilos, you're no longer wearing that weight vest. Therefore, your energy expenditure is going to be lower, right? So easy way to conceptualize it. That was the best way I've heard of doing it. So that's the example I use now. Thank you, Paddy. So yeah, are we happy with the calorie setup there?
Yeah, and the reason we spent so long on calories is because it's arguably the most important thing. If you get your calories right, like the rest of the stuff, like you can kind of fuck around with. Like we would be an advocate of getting your protein at least in a good place, which we'll talk about next. That's why we're talking about it next. But as long as your calories are in a good place, you can get very far, both in terms of body composition and health outcomes, you know? Now, is it ideal? Probably not. To just think of calories, probably not ideal to be like, that's the single thing I think about with nutrition. But if you just thought of calories, you would be in a pretty good place, you know? But moving on, protein is next. Now, I generally just think of protein as a bit of a range. And the reason for this is because there's an amount that is, let's call it sufficient, you know, and then there's an amount that's probably more optimal. And then there's an amount that's probably a good bit of redundancy built into it, you know, just in case maybe you need a little bit higher, you know, like maybe you, I don't know, it fills you up. They're the type of foods that you like, you know, there's a bit of redundancy, right? And generally what I say is the range is somewhere in the range of 1.5 to 2.5 grams per kilo. So if you just get your body weight and multiply it by 1.5, like that's the kind of minimum threshold we want to be eating for your protein intake if we're talking about optimizing body composition, health, performance, right? You could go up to 2.5. So again, just get your body weight, multiply it by 2.5. And again, there you go. Okay, that's probably the higher end. Now we can go higher intakes. You can go up to like 4.4 and be like, oh, there's no negative adverse reactions to this. And you can also go lower and still technically be hitting a relatively sufficient amount. Although, I would argue against some of those methods that they use to say that 0.8 grams or whatever they use is optimal. But that's generally the range that I use. Now, we could modify that based on your actual lean mass. So if you're someone that is obese, for example, if you multiply your body weight by 2.5, like you're going to get a pretty fucking big number because you're multiplying your body weight by 2.5 and you're obese, right? So that's not necessarily representative of the actual protein that you need, because body fat itself doesn't really contribute, well, not massively at least, to protein requirements, right? It's mainly lean mass, which is like, your bones, your muscles, your organs, that kind of shit, right? So that is a case where I would kind of go, like, if you're obese or you have a lot of weight to lose, I'd be like, I'd probably stick closer to the lower end of the range, right? However, we also have to take into account that protein is very satiating. So if you have a slightly higher protein intake, you're probably going to feel a little bit fuller for longer. So we don't want to just go, oh, look, you have a lot of fat to lose, so we're just going to go lower protein intake. Well, lower 1.5 is generally still higher than what most people eat, but we're going to go on the lower end of the range. So there is a little bit of give in here, play, because we're not actually accurately able to tell your lean body mass. Even if you got a DEXA scan, it's not perfectly accurate. Like, it's good to go, but it's not perfect, right? And if we did know that, we could maybe get a little bit of a more specific number. But even then, there are still different like energetic requirements, different populations, different fucking whatever, that have different protein needs as a result. And also then we can talk about, like the specifics of your diet, because protein intake is actually just a proxy for amino acid intake. So if you were able to get the perfect amino acid blend, maybe you would be able to eat lower protein and still be good to go, but that's not the real world. So generally I find 1.5 to 2.5 grams per kilo is kind of the sweet spot. I'll modify within that based on what I think the client needs. But if you're a listener to this and you're kind of going, I don't know how to modify this based on me, you're probably good to pick somewhere like 1.8 to 2, somewhere in that range, 1.8 grams per kilo or 2 grams per kilo. You're pretty fucking good to go. Like, you'll be in a great spot. Now, again, there are caveats and modifications to that, but I would be pretty happy if most people were like, oh yeah, I eat 1.8 grams per kilo of body weight in protein. What are your thoughts, boys?
Yeah, that's spot on. I think, you have to give someone a target, but not make it exceptionally lofty at the start. So I'll often set people up kind of in the middle of that range, you said, around that 1.82 gram area. Like, obviously with our experience as coaches as well, like, we have a good intuition about what might be most appropriate for the person in front of us. Also where they're at in terms of like their goals. The person in deficit arguably will benefit from having more protein versus surplus. The potential if you're carrying a lot of extra fat mass is important. So I'm glad you mentioned that. You might set that using like quote unquote ideal weight. Although that's not always perfect either, because if I judged by BMI and stuff, like, I'm overweight. So, but that's kind of
you are overweight.
You are a really, really easy way. If you're like, look, I just don't want to think about this stuff. I just want to give me a specific number. Just take your height in centimeters, whatever that is, right? So I'm 195 centimeters, 195 grams of protein per day. I'm probably fucking bang on. Like, I eat about 225, 225 grams of protein per day, right? Now that's not perfect by any means, but if you're just like quick, easy hitter, just take your height in centimeters, boom, there you go. Again, some people are going to need less, especially women usually need a little bit less than that. But that's kind of just really hit it out the park. Boom, one number, there you go.
Yeah. Yeah, very simple. Because like again, you could like people might spend inordinate amounts of time and energy thinking about what's the perfect protein number for me, whereas you actually have to just start getting in and implementing this stuff consistently, right? Which is, one of the main points of this conversation. So, how do we actually improve the protein intake across the day? Because that will also like spontaneously improve the rest of the diet pretty much. Because if you have this protein target to hit, let's just say it's 150 grams. Like, let's see if this protein target hit. You usually have 3 meals a day, plus or minus a snack or two. It's like, cool. That leaves us with, about 50 grams of protein per meal. And this is how I coach people with this, because like as we always say, it's like, it's not enough to just say, oh yeah, go hit your 150 grams of protein. Like, just get after it and talk to me next week when you've done that. But
Well,
it helps.
oftentimes, just to interject, I oftentimes do that for the first week, purely so that we can actually identify where the biggest downfalls are, and the person can kind of learn. Now, obviously, I say it to them. I'm like, look, I'm throwing you in the deep end here. This is going to be a learning experience. You're not going to get it perfect. I just want you to try. But the reason I do that is, and obviously that's part of the coaching process. Like, that doesn't work for everyone. Some people I need to actually straight out the gate help them a bit more. But the reason I do that is because it actually does teach you. Because arguably, like you're saying here, if we get calories in the right place and then we go, okay, we're eating enough protein, like that isn't enough to just tell someone, oh yeah, eat enough protein, eat enough calories. We actually have to translate that into how you actually eat in a given day, right? Like, what are your breakfasts going to look like? What are your lunches going to look like? What are your dinners going to look like? How's your protein distribution across the day? Like, are you eating? Most people don't eat enough protein at breakfast, like if you have 150 grams of protein to eat and you have 3 meals, people would genuinely struggle with 50 grams of protein at breakfast, like that's not how most people grew up eating, right? So I'll throw them in the deep end, and then we can identify, they're like, oh fuck, actually, yeah, I see this, that look, I can get enough protein at lunch, I'm getting like 50 grams there, and then I'm getting enough at dinner, I'm getting like 50 grams there, but breakfast, I'm just not getting anything. So then we can kind of go, okay, so that's the thing, that's the key where we need to focus. And once we can solve that, it's going to make the rest of your day a lot easier, because you're already fuller, you're already like hitting your protein target. It's much easier, So I personally like throwing people in the deep end and then helping them modify from there. But if you're doing this yourself, like obviously that's not great. And we really do need to focus on the habits, especially around protein, because a lot of people just don't eat enough protein. They never grew up like that. They don't know how to fit that in across the day. And ideally, we want to have a nice distribution of protein throughout the day. And that has to come with a little bit of pre-planning or forethought to actually be able to do that.
Yeah. And like, you're going to have, like, I talk to people a lot about go-to meals. You're going to have go-to meals that are going to be your standard reliable meals. It's like, the typical breakfast that I have with, oats and whey protein as the protein source and a lot of berries and stuff like that. It's like, that satisfies, a third, let's say, of my protein targets for the day. It also solves, a third or even a half of my fiber targets for the day, depending on what exactly I put into that. So like, for me, that's a fantastic go-to meal because it ticks some boxes for me. So you're gonna develop meals like that for yourself. And as I said, yeah, most people don't eat enough for breakfast, so that we have to talk about ways to do that. I don't always throw people into the deep end, because if they've given me a sample day of eating, it's pretty clear based on that. Okay, like, I see you're having porridge for breakfast, and okay, so that's clearly quite a low protein breakfast. So we can start to intervene on that right away. Start adding in some like either protein powders or protein yogurts, protein drinks. There's so many options these days. And my philosophy in terms of coaching nutrition is like, all right, I'm going to get someone from point A to point B, A being average diet, B being brilliant diet. And I want to start where the person is actually at and then just start modifying things. So I don't need to tell somebody, okay, fuck off your porridge. You're going to have 200 grams of elk for breakfast, right?
Those sound great.
Like, what?
Those sound great though.
Yeah.
I mean, I've been there, like meat and nuts breakfast, rotating. I've done that, right? So, But I was very committed, and make increasing the level of difficulty for implementation of change is a pretty surefire way to not implement the change and to fall off and end up in the same place you were a year ago, which is obviously what we don't want. So if someone's having porridge for breakfast, okay, it's an additive approach to nutrition. So let's, instead of saying take that porridge out of there, Jesus, what are you doing having carbs in the morning? You're going to be fucking asleep before 11 a.m. right? Which is nonsense. But add in the protein sources there, like the ones I mentioned, in the quantity that you need to hit whatever that protein per meal target is. And that's what I'll do with people. Like, okay, cool, this is your total daily protein intake target. You have usually 3 meals a day, right? So that's going to be 50 grams of protein per meal. What does 50 grams of protein look like, right? And I'll just give them a list of portions that actually meet that quantity, right? And just the primary protein sources, your meats and poultry and fish and dairy and eggs and like the vegan sources as well, soy-based stuff and mycoprotein or whatever. Tell them, like, okay, this is what a portion to give you that amount of protein looks like, and then we go with there. And one way I might break this down is like, okay, maybe 150 grams is 1.5 grams of protein per kilo, right? So I might help someone set up their meals so they're getting that much from those primary sources, and then you're going to get a little bit from like grains, you're going to get a little bit from like pulses, things like carbohydrate sources, which like sprinkle in a few more grams across the day, but they're not really what I want people thinking about in terms of like, oh, this is like a main way I get my protein in. So if you've helped someone achieve 1.5 grams per kilo based on primary sources, they might land at 2 grams per kilo, like when you take all that other stuff into account. Yeah. So yeah, you need to help people figure out how to implement that. And like, yeah, I mean, you can definitely get a long way, as you said, Paddy, with just having your calories set up properly. Though we work with a lot of people who've like, oh, I've tried calorie tracking, but I never tried any macro constituents to that, and they didn't have much success. So it does help. So yeah, so they could have done that, but then even people who might hit their like total daily protein, like they could do that. I still see it, like people will report in their check-ins like, oh geez, I was super hungry for whatever reason on these days. And if we go and look at it, it's like, oh, you actually omitted your protein source at breakfast for some reason. Therefore, you ended up a lot hungrier earlier in the day. And that may have lent itself to overeating as a result because your appetite was just higher. So we have to appreciate the appetite controlling effects that a proper distribution of protein might contribute to in this case. So it is important. Like, yeah, we can say, oh yeah, no, we can be real simplistic about it. It's like, oh, yeah, just hit enough protein per day, bro, and you'll get stronger and get bigger. But a lot of this nutrition coaching and then applying nutrition change for yourself is about making life easier for yourself in terms of staying on the path and hitting the goals that you want to achieve. So yeah, you could say, okay, it doesn't really matter about the protein distribution, except it does when you're looking at the implementation of it.
Yeah, in the real world, it matters. Okay, so I think hopefully people have an idea of protein. Now we're just going to fly through the rest of this because most of it's pretty intuitive. Well, it's not actually intuitive. I don't know why I said that. It's really not intuitive at all. There's nothing intuitive about the diet. But fats, we're probably going to set them at somewhere around 0.6 grams per kilo. Now we could go up to 1 gram per kilo. That's generally the range. But if we're talking about a general kind of fat loss diet, we're probably going to limit extra fats. And an easy way to do that is go, okay, 0.6 grams per kilo. That's a rough and ready rule. The next thing we're going to set is the rest of the calories. So whatever we have left, we set our protein, we set our fats, the rest of the calories, they can go towards carbs. Now, if you have a preference, you're like, actually, I prefer a little bit of a lower carb diet, a little bit more fats. That's cool. Carbs and fats, in my eyes, they're pretty equal. As long as you're getting at least 0.5, we'll say, grams per kilo of fat, I really don't care what the way you organize the rest of your diet. Like if you want to go, I'm going to hit my protein and fat and I'm going to eat trace carbs, I don't care as much. Now that's not optimal for a lot of different goals, but we're still maintaining the calories where they should be. we're eating enough protein, and the rest of the stuff is just an energy substrate, you know. But most people are going to want to eat carbs, so set your fats 0.6 grams per kilo, set the carbs as the rest of the diet. But then a further modification of that is ideally we want to have 10 to 15 grams of fiber per 1,000 calories. So if you're eating 2,000 calories, you're eating 20 to 30 grams of fiber, right? And that does a few different things. Namely, it actually makes you set your set your food intake in a good place, because you actually start eating your fruit and veg, right? So if you set your fiber target as 15 grams per 1,000 calories, and you're like, oh, I'm not able to hit that. Okay, well, we need to actually start eating more fruit and veg to hit that. You know, it's not just, oh, I'll bring in a fiber supplement. Like that's not ideal. You want to eat fruit and veg, right? So that's generally how we set things up. The further modification that I would say to that is that we ideally want to eat less than 10% of our diet, our total calories, to come from saturated fat. That would be the only real modification I would make to the fats goal. Now we could also get into like, oh, you should have omega-3s and, you know, whatever, but we can forget about that for now at the initial setup, and we just want to ideally get saturated fat so that it's not too high, the rest of the diet in a good place, and then we're kind of good to go. Do you have anything else to add on that, Brian? Because I know we're basically glossing over a lot of things here, because look, we only have so long on the podcast to discuss this stuff, and I don't want to have this turn into a 4-hour podcast, which it easily could be if we're talking about a diet setup. Like we've talked about it before. There is going to be a lot of stuff on our website about it soon enough. But just for now, do you have anything to add to those general recommendations of the fats, carbs, fiber?
Yeah, I mean, I agree that the fat and carb ratios don't really matter, but if you're again trying to hit that sort of fiber target, that will usually lend itself to eating more carbohydrates. I think having a higher carbohydrate diet also looks more like a normal diet that this person is going to be coming to you with. And like I said already, I want to make minor changes to someone's existing diet to get them from A to B, rather than, making drastic changes, which, going really low carb, super high fat will probably look like for most people. Because most people are probably already eating a pretty carbohydrate dense diet, and it's like, cool, can we just start modifying the sources of those carbohydrates? Can we make them higher fiber, higher nutrient, make sure that you're getting more nutrition from them, when that those meals are more filling and stuff as a result. And again, that will make the actual implementation of the change easier, rather than saying like, oh, I'm going to pull your carbs right down, and then just like inject a lot of fat, because like that's going to be a lot harder for someone to implement, because they're like, what do you mean I have to, how do I have to eat like 6 avocados a day here? What? Like, I'm not used to doing that. Whereas you're probably used to having a carbohydrate source, probably used to having your porridge in the morning, and then some sort of bread or whatever at lunch, and then potatoes or pasta or something for dinner. So again, you can make sustainable change. You can help people make changes that they can actually do, and don't really struggle to implement, that ultimately can lead to failure. And the omega-3 thing, like, you'll have a conversation about that. Like, it's in the questionnaire. Do you eat oily fish? If you don't, then you're gonna be like told to take an omega-3 supplement pretty much straight away. It's very low hanging fruit from a health standpoint and improving the quality of the diet. So that'll get taken care of pretty easily, like with minimal effort. If you eat the fish, then cool. Work enough of that fish into your week, right? Choose as a protein source. That's basically how you do it. If you don't eat the fish, then cool, buy an omega-3 supplement, start using it, and that's taken care of. So that'll be sorted out pretty easily with minimal effort. But otherwise, no, I think that's all spot on. Obviously, people who are training more will benefit from a higher carbohydrate diet as well, for the most part. So that's another consideration. Like, if you have performance-based goals, then going on a very low carb, high fat diet is not going to be great for that. So that's another kind of consideration when you're setting that stuff up. But I know we're just talking about like fat loss specifically with this conversation.
Yeah. And Gary, do you have anything to add to those general recommendations?
I don't think so. I think that covers most of what I put into practice really. I'm fairly flexible in terms of like the carb and fat ratios myself. Like I'm always, protein and calorie focused, and I'll most often allow someone's diet, the foods they normally consume, to drive the remainder of the ratios. Some people, of course, they prefer higher fat diets and they prefer higher carbohydrate diets. And once we're not going to the extreme with, for example, like the saturated fat, like you mentioned, or compromising performance because we're just not eating enough carbohydrates. I'm pretty flexible for my athletic clients and people who are really focused on performance. I will really try and keep the carbs as high as possible while bringing fats down as low as is practical. And for me, at least, I'm probably more often concerned about the practical restriction in overall food choices that occurs with very low fat intakes rather than like a genuine concern of not having enough essential fatty acids or compromising hormone production. I think those concerns are a little bit overblown.
It also only really
So
makes sense when you're very lean.
yeah, it's like for most people, it's just not a huge concern. So a lot of the barriers for me end up being practical. So I think in summary that covers pretty much everything we would want to say. The only thing I wanted to follow up on was just in terms of like when people get all those recommendations and they put them in place, they often end up with other questions because they kind of come from the bodybuilding world and they'll say, do I need to cycle my calories? Do I need to have rest day and training day calories? And we kind of bring that again back to the point that we said in the beginning when Brian said it's all about the medium to long term. So whether you cycle your calories, whether you have rest day and training day calories, ultimately your fat loss or your body weight change is determined by your average calorie intake across the week. So whether you split that each day, we still focus on that average. Some of my clients, they prefer to have higher calories in a training day and they don't have much of an appetite on a rest day. For me, I'm actually a bit like that. My appetite is very much exercise dependent. So if I'm not training, I'll generally eat a bit less. But for the most part, I think for simplicity's sake, I always recommend that people just try to hold constant throughout the week, or maybe like plus or minus 1 or 200 calories. But the average is what we're really concerned about over time. Would you agree?
100%. And also just on that, this is an important thing. There's natural interhuman variability with this stuff in terms of like Gary's like, oh, my calories are driven by my exercise. Whereas I feel like I'm the exact opposite. I'm like, if I don't exercise, I feel like I'm hungrier. I feel like exercise has a, hunger blunting effect for me. I'll train in the morning and I'm like, I literally could give or take food. I'm like, I'm not that hungry anymore. Like I'll train twice per day and I'm like, I'm not that hungry. I'll literally have a day off and I'm like, man, I'm fucking starving all day. So that's just an important note.
Yeah, absolutely.
Anyway, the final thing that I want to just touch on is, and we touched on it throughout, we're using all those recommendations. I'm going to blast through them again, and then we're going to go into this, right? So calories, this is set based on your intake and then how your body weight changes. So track everything for a week, 2 weeks, note how your body weight changes. If it goes up, you're in a surplus. If it goes down, you're in a deficit. If it stays the same, you're at maintenance. Let's assume you know roughly where maintenance is. We're going to drop calories, assuming we're going for fat loss. We're going to drop calories by, let's just say 10% out the gate, right? I generally am like, look, 300 calorie deficit, that's probably where a lot of people want to be. Obviously, that's different if you're a small person and you're eating only 1,500 calories. Like eating 1,200 calories is a lot different than eating 3,000 calories for your fat loss diet, just in terms of the practicality of it. Now, in terms of the actual fat loss that occurs, probably similar, but again, practical here, right? So find your calories, reduce calories. We're setting our protein at 1.5 to 2.5 grams per kilo. Again, refer back to the discussion. Fats, 0.6 grams per kilo. Carbs, the rest, whatever is left of those calories, right? And then we're further setting a goal of 10 to 15 grams of fiber per 1,000 calories, right? Cool. That's the baseline. There, we've summarized the last fucking hour of the podcast, right? But what we actually want to do is translate all of that information, translate it into what does that actually look like for a day for you. And the best way to do this in my mind is to go, let me actually sit down here and plan out an ideal day for me. Don't just try to wing it. Don't just try to go, oh, well, I'll see what happens. Sit down and go, what can I actually do just on my phone, on MyFitnessPal, to make my diet that I'm currently eating look more like what I want to hit. So you go through, like we were saying, you're like, oh, at breakfast, I realized that I'm not eating enough protein. You know, you don't actually have to do the day to realize that. You can just map out the day. Oh, I'm not eating enough protein there. What sources of protein could I get there? Oh, maybe some high protein, Greek yogurt type deal, a protein shake. Cool. Okay, so I've solved that. What happens next? Oh, well, actually, now I'm over on my carbohydrates. Oh, actually, I'm eating a huge amount of carbohydrates at dinner, and can I modify that a little bit? So actually, just plan out your day. Look at it. Okay, cool. There's an ideal day, right? I've distributed the protein throughout the day. I have a good spread of calories throughout the day. I'm not doing anything, silly, just out the gate going like, oh, I'm going to intermittent fast. I'm going to have a 2-hour eating window. Like, we're not doing anything like that. Like, yeah, maybe you do that in future if you really, really enjoy it. But at least initially, we're eating a normal human diet, which is spread throughout the day, right? Then when we're doing that, when we actually put that in play, we're noticing how we feel after those meals. We're noticing how our hunger is, how our energy levels are, and then we're noticing how those different meal structures actually make us feel, etc. Right? But we're also learning from that. We're also learning, going, okay, so that's roughly what I should feel like after a meal of that size. That's roughly what a meal should look like to hit these calories and macros. Cool. We're not just going into this following basically a meal plan you've created for yourself. You're learning from this, right? So that in future we can start moving you away from calorie and macro tracking, right? But before we do that, we also want to ideally improve your food selection, eating enough fruits and veg throughout the day. And again, we can set targets on that, going, oh, I want you to eat 10, 12 fruits and veg per day. I want you to eat 5 fruits, whatever it is, right? We can set targets for that, but ultimately I just want you to eat more fruits and veg, right? We can, again, modify our saturated fat intake, getting that a little bit lower than most people eat. Although nowadays, most people are around the kind of 11, 12%, if I remember correctly. So we're doing that. Better food selection. Cool. We've got that. We're able to hit our calories. We're able to hit our macros. We're getting the fat loss results that we want. Ultimately, we need to be thinking, what am I going to do after I've got all the fat loss, right? I'm at the perfect body weight for me. I'm at the body composition that I want. What are we doing after that? Oh, we're eventually going to increase our calories, right? Where am I going to increase calories distributed throughout the day? Oh, well, actually, I find that, lunchtime, I could definitely be eating a little bit more. I get a little bit hungrier coming into dinner time, or maybe actually I would like to have a snack here or there. Cool. We can be thinking about that after the fat loss phase. We do the fat loss phase. We slowly increase calories, just a small amount. Again, we can just go, let's say 200. We just add that, see how your body responds. Oh, you're actually still in a deficit. You're still losing weight. Let's add another 100 calories. And we can go out nice and slow like that, because especially if this is your first time, you don't want to just go, oh, I'll just add 500 calories and we're all good, right? So that's something to be thinking. What am I going to do after this fat loss diet? And more to the point, most people aren't going to want to track their calories for the rest of their life. So we have to use all the good habits that we just built in building that diet and then implementing that diet. We have to use those and then actually put those habits into play, rather than just leaning on MyFitnessPal or whatever other calorie tracking app that you've been using, rather than just using that for the rest of your life. Now, some of you might like that. I like MyFitnessPal. I like logging my food. But a lot of people don't. So the only way we're going to get away from MyFitnessPal is to slowly start phasing it out. And the only way you can do that is if you know what a rough, 2000 calories roughly looks like. How does that look like on my plate spread throughout the day? How much protein do I need to be eating in terms of just food selection, rather than, oh, I'll just use my app, right? So do either of you have anything to add to that? Because the implementation is arguably the hard part, and that's arguably where a lot of the coaching actually occurs. But hopefully, as we've gone through just setting the targets and bringing up some of the different issues that come along with that, hopefully that's given you a few ideas about the habits. But do you have anything to say on that, Gary?
I think just to say that, obviously, longer term, tracking isn't forever. But it is something that I think, even though I find myself saying that a lot, I find myself saying, you don't have to track. There are many different ways to approach your nutrition. Most of my clients track for at least a period of time. And I think the biggest thing is probably the educational component associated with that. Because I find myself, especially when I'm working with clients, and I've had a few of these recently, who have got a generally healthful diet. They're health conscious, and they wouldn't be eating poorly by any means. but then I get them to track for a while, and it's so clear that their conception as to where they might get their protein, where they might get their fiber is just all over the place. And there's massive variability. So their idea of a healthy breakfast one day might have 7 grams of protein, and the next day might have 40. And there's just no consistency in terms of how the diet might actually contribute to someone's goals. So I had one client recently whose average protein intake was coming in at 70 to 80 grams. And this is someone with a muscle and strength development goal, because he was just kind of following what he believed to be conventionally healthy eating, and that's potentially 50% of the protein intake I'd want to eat. So despite the fact that he's doing everything well, this period of tracking now is actually going to take things up a whole other level for him, and that'll stick with him then for the long term, because he'll realize, okay, porridge is a healthy breakfast, but let me get a scoop of whey protein, or let me have a high protein yogurt on the side. And it's actually just these small, simple little changes that are then very easy to sustain long term. But I think tracking, at the very least, it will be a great educational tool, and at most, it will drastically improve your results, which it does for a lot of people as well.
100%. Brian?
Yeah, agree with all that stuff. I had a look there at my own tracking document. I haven't tracked since the end of July, and what I've maintained my weight, basically pushed it up a little bit as planned. So a lot of that just comes down to the fact that, my food selection doesn't vary a huge amount, because like I have my go-to meals. Yes, I eat a variety of meals, but it's like I always have in mind, like, oh yeah, I'm trying to get this much of a protein-rich food, this much of a carbohydrate-rich food. Like I said earlier, there's not a huge amount of variation food group to food group once you understand how to categorize them. I think having a plan, like, is one of the best things for people. And I think that especially in difficult situations, right? Because we've talked about how to set up a diet and everything else, but we haven't talked much at all about, what actually gets in the way of that, right? So we're like, someone needs to, first of all, understand how to implement kind of their ideal day. But then a large part of the actual coaching process is how do we navigate when things are more difficult, right? So I think about, I coach a lot of doctors, they work nights, they find that more challenging, they're super busy on the night shift, or if they're on call or something, what are, solutions to that problem of like, I don't really have time to sit down and eat, my circadian rhythm is a bit all over the place, the food availability in the middle of the night is nowhere near as good as during the day. There's this, solidarity of night shift work where we all bring in kind of treats and then help each other get through it. And chocolate and stuff is just omnipresent in a hospital setting this time of year, especially, right? So that's where things get a bit more complicated. It's like, all right, well, how do I actually do that? And like, again, a lot of it is just having a plan. A lot of people will understand, like, okay, I know what I need to try and do here in this context. I've thought about what gets in the way of that. So what am I going to do? And like, I often don't think my solutions are groundbreaking, but just giving that bit of thought to the planning, so how am I actually going to go about this? And then once you have that plan set, like with any other kind of meal structure, it's like, cool, well, now I know that, I'm going to bring a lot of fruit in with me. I'm going to use the Huel shakes, because I can mix them up pretty quick, and they're, high protein and a complete meal essentially, or whatever. And that's how I get through that specific situation. And there's going to be a lot of specific situations for you, the meals out, the weekend family gatherings, etc. But you have to have those kind of principles in mind, like what I'm actually trying to do with the diet. Question I often ask people is like, well, how do you make food choices? Like, you're putting a meal together, like, based on what? And people often don't give it that much thought. But once you've gone through this educational process of being like, okay, I have goals that I'm trying to achieve with my nutrition. I know that these are the things I need to focus on for those goals. So how do I still try and tick those boxes no matter what the situation? Whereas most people, if they don't give much consideration to the nutrition, it's just like, what's convenient, what's tastes nice, and that's maybe it for a lot of people before they start taking interest in this stuff. Yeah, so having a plan works wonders, I think. Again, there's going to be certain situations, individual to individual, that will make this a little bit trickier. You know, I have a client at the moment who is vegetarian. You know, so she eats dairy products and eggs, and then but doesn't eat any of the plant substitutes because she doesn't like the textures of them and stuff, right? So won't eat the plant substitutes. What, Patty?
They're disgusting.
She actually finds them too reminiscent of meat, actually, to eat them. So won't eat the plant substitutes. So that makes, you know, things a little bit trickier, because it's like, right, we have a lot less options basically in terms of food selection. So, you know, for people listening to this, you may have specific considerations, special situations where, you know, obviously we can't just cover every hypothetical or scenario that we've experienced in a podcast. Patty said we're here for, well, longer than 4 hours, is that right? But that's just another thing, another layer on top of this is like, yeah, once you have your diet in a good place based on like normal routine day to day, then we also have to help you figure out these other situations where things aren't as routine. And that's, you know, a large part of the coaching job. Like I said earlier, is a lot of it's just problem solving. It's like, what are the speed bumps to you heading to where you want to get to with your nutrition and your goals, and how can we help you overcome them without, you know, ripping all the axles out of the car.
100%. I mean, I don't really have anything else to add. Like, I know we could definitely go down a few more rabbit holes, but unless you have anything else to add, Gary, do you want to wrap this up?
Yeah, I think that's all the basics covered. And if you'd like more than the basics covered and more specific guidance, of course, we have coaching spaces available at Triage, and you can work with either of the coaches in this episode and the other members of our excellent coaching team. So you'll find the application form for that and details of coaching below. So check those out if you're interested heading into the new year. Now, other than that, we put out a lot of other free information. So you can subscribe to our Triage Method newsletter, which goes out weekly on a Monday, and that will give you more free content, along with that available on our social media at Triage Method and on our available public personal, I should say, accounts as well. So make sure you're following all those. If you're enjoying the podcast, we always appreciate when people share the podcast, leave a rating and review. And if you're someone that coming into the new year, you want to increase your nutrition education specifically, we do have a nutrition certification. So whether you're a personal trainer, a budding personal trainer, wannabe nutritionist, we do recommend that you sign up to our course and bump up your nutrition knowledge and competence in coaching everything that we've discussed here as well. So that's all for this week, guys. This is coming out New Year's Day, is it? Or is it? Yeah.
No, Monday's the 2nd, isn't it?
Oh, the 2nd. Well, anyway, I hope your New Year's off to a good start. Goodbye.